Well, it's 6:30, so I guess we should get started. Okay, yeah, so thanks for coming again, especially given the kind of proto-apocalyptic heat conditions. Although it might seem, it's going to be pretty hot, I reckon, for the rest of this course, so although it might seem that that's sort of a drag on our ability to kind of grapple with this kind of material, I think this quotation to Don DeLillo's novel White Noise that Nick Land cites in his essay Meltdown, I think it suggests that maybe actually proto-apocalyptic heat is precisely the best conditions to engage with the critique of everything, comforting and human. I'll just read it out because I think it's a nice prologue. Heat, this is what cities mean to me. You get off the train and walk out of the station and you are hit with the full blast. The heat of air, traffic and people, the heat of food and sex, the heat of tall buildings, the heat that flows out of the subways and tunnels. It's always 15 degrees hotter in the cities. Heat rises from the sidewalks and falls from the poisoned sky. The buses breathe heat. Heat emanates from crowds of shoppers and office workers. The entire infrastructure is based on heat, desperately uses up heat, breathes more heat. The eventual heat death of the universe that scientists love to talk about is already well underway, and you can feel it happening all around you in any large or medium-sized city. Heat and wetness. So, I guess, in other words, if we think it's like things are already sort of not to our liking in terms of the weather, what Land tells us by way of Don DeLillo is, we haven't seen anything yet.
Warming, bring it on?
Oh, things are just going to get much hotter, right?
Know that.
Yeah. Okay, so, all right. Other than Immanuel Kant, whom we looked at last week, the young Land's other kind of arch-nemeses are phenomenologists, who for Land include more kind of heterodoxical figures like Hegel and Derrida, as well as more standard phenomenologists like Husserl and Heidegger. And that's because he sees them all as more or less recapitulating Kant's anthropocentric hubris over the past 2 centuries. So today we're going to examine Land's critique of the phenomenological tradition from Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, briefly, and all the way to Derrida's deconstruction, and particularly focusing on what Land sees as Heidegger's misreading of the Austrian poet Georg Trakl's work. Specifically, it's a misreading because it mistakes Trakl's various images of animality, irrationality, and death as rather narcissistic symbols of spirit, reason, and even the divine. Again, it's in 2 parts. So we might take a break this week as well, in between. But okay, let's just jump straight in. Yeah, okay, so Land's somewhat idiosyncratic conception of phenomenology as a fundamentally post-Kantian tradition means that he believes it to commence with Hegel. Now, there's sort of many ways into Hegel. I'm only going to be very brief here. But, one possible characterization of what Hegel's project is doing is it's trying to reconcile, perhaps synthesize, various kind of contradictions and divisions in both Kant and post-Kant, the immediate kind of post-Kantian thought. So, divisions between, for example, the phenomena and the noumena, the things for us and the things in themselves, and also, divisions that we saw last week between free moral agents like ourselves and a mechanical nature, or subject and object, subject and nature. So that's the division I'm going to focus on just briefly here, is that there's an immediate division in some post-Kantian thought, like Fichte and a certain late Schelling, where there's this clear division between the free subject and who's a moral agent and so on, and then a seemingly mechanical, deterministic nature. So for Hegel, we're able to actually combine subject and nature into one concept of the absolute. They don't need to be opposed, provided that we begin to re-envision nature not as opposed to the subject, but as always already structured like the free subject. So this is from, I think, Hegel's first book. He says, Fichte's writings and their reception indicate the need of a philosophy that will recompensate nature for the mishandling that it suffers in Kant and Fichte's systems, and set reason itself in harmony with nature, not by having reason renounce itself or become an insipid imitator of nature, but by reason recasting itself into nature out of its own inner strength. So very briefly, the idea is that by transposing reason onto nature, Hegel holds that we can account for how free subjects emerge out of what is actually a rather similarly structured rather than incongruous ground. So, in the Phenomenology of Spirit, one of Hegel's kind of masterworks, Hegel proceeds to reimagine nature, as he puts it, quote, not only as substance but equally as subject. So the Phenomenology details reason's triadic structure or triadic movement to be itself as a free self-consciousness by paradoxically negating itself in order to become an object of its own thought. Now, while there are many kind of sub-dialectical triads upon triads in the Phenomenology, the takeaway point for our purposes is that for self-consciousness to be, qua the thought of itself, that's what self-consciousness is, consciousness has to paradoxically kind of alienate, externalize, or negate its pure self-identity as an other of itself so that it can therefore think itself and take itself as an object. So Hegel puts this in jargon-filled terms. The living substance is being which is in truth subject, or what is the same, is in truth actual only insofar as it is the movement of positing itself or is the mediation of its self-othering with itself. So for Hegel, nature is really nothing but spirit's own self-negation to paradoxically commune with itself as an object or other of its own thought. Now, according to Land's brief tarrying with Hegel in The Thirst for Annihilation, Hegel saw Kant's idea of an actually existing yet inaccessible noumena as a threat to any kind of unified system of the absolute. And so Hegel's way of mitigating this noumenal excess that we looked at last week is to show how the noumenal excess is immanently generated by reason as a way for reason to think itself, to be reason as self-consciousness. Land says, Hegel considered Kant's basic failing to be an inability to see that the limits of reason are self-legislated, so that when intelligibility is absolutely consummated, the ethical order is recognized as commanding for nature. Finitude is only possible through a spiritual production, transcending and comprehending it as a necessary moment of itself. So if Hegel marks what he calls an absolute idealism rather than merely Kant's transcendental idealism, it's because Hegel eliminates Kant's notion of the thing in itself for failing to see that this supposed limit concept or boundary of reason in itself is actually reason's own self-legislation. We'll come back to Hegel when we look at Heidegger in a bit, but just to keep going. So it's, of course, Husserl who really founded the 20th century phenomenological tradition proper when he sought to save philosophy from the reign of the sciences by bracketing off what Husserl called our natural attitude to believe in the independent existence of objects of our experience, and also making what Husserl called a transcendental reduction of the object of philosophical study to the phenomena of our experience, without regard for this kind of Kantian idea of a noumenal reality. So Husserl himself says, the exclusion of nature was for us the methodical means for initially making possible the turning of regard to transcendentally pure consciousness. Okay, now in light of this bracketing of the natural attitude in favour of this transcendental reduction to the confines of the subjective, Land argues that Husserl's phenomenology essentially reprises Kant's transcendental idealism, inasmuch as both bracket nature to assert the primacy of the I over its supposed negation in the object, in nature. So Land says in the second point, if in the Hegelian mode of philosophizing, alterity is reduced in a collective auto-generative knowing, in the Husserlian mode it is reduced into a monadic transcendental ego for which the Kantian noumenon is bracketed as a transcendent or naturalistic postulate. So, as per Hegel, Husserl certainly acknowledges that there are objects that seem to be opposed to the subject, right? But as per Hegel again, at least on Land's reading, Husserl argues that these objects appear to be opposed to us only because all experience is intentional. Intentional in the sense that our self only finds itself outside itself as the consciousness of objects. That's what intentionality is. It's consciousness is always consciousness of something. So Land puts this pretty kind of caustically. Rigorous phenomenology of the Husserlian type, whereby all questions of reference are replaced by an analytic of intentionality, leads straight to idealism and solipsism, and thus, as Schopenhauer persuasively suggests, to the madhouse. So yeah, as far as phenomenologists from Hegel to Husserl are concerned, this kind of noumenal alterity is simply the means for the becoming of the transcendental subject by this subject intentionally taking itself as an object of its own thought. Okay, now at first glance, it might seem as if Husserl's former student Heidegger might provide the very critique of this earlier phenomenology that Land himself is seeking to provide. You know, after all, Heidegger famously begins his 1927 magnum opus, Being and Time, by raising anew the question of the meaning of being, which he claims that Western philosophy has essentially all but forgotten. And this is because the history of philosophy, as Heidegger sees it, has always conflated being with what Heidegger calls presence at hand, that is, what is present at hand to us, you know, whether it's Plato's theory of transcendent ideas based on our values of what's good, true, and beautiful, and Descartes', you know, cogito, or whether it's Kant's transcendental concepts of reason, or Hegel's absolute spirit, right? Heidegger says, by looking at the world theoretically, we have already dimmed it down to the uniformity of what is purely present at hand to thought. So yeah, whether it's through this kind of more traditional kind of ontotheology of God, of an anthropic God, or in a more secular, cunning guise of the transcendental phenomenological subject, philosophy has simply too often attempted to conflate the being, what Heidegger calls the being of all beings, with one particular, essentially, you know, bipedal, mammalian being. So Heidegger contends, if being is not what is present at hand, it can only be that which withdraws from or refuses to be present. In Being and Time, Heidegger commences this analysis of the true meaning of being by beginning with humans, or it's slightly different, but what he also calls Dasein. And he begins with this because, you know, Dasein is the only being that's even capable of raising the question of being in the first place. Now, while he analyzes Dasein in many guises, it's particularly in being struck by the possibility of its own death that Dasein grasps that being is more than its presence at hand to it. You know, because it comes to recognize that its own being can just as well be and not be, and with it, everything that is present to it. So Heidegger says at the bottom there, Dasein always understands itself in terms of its existence, in terms of a possibility of itself, to be itself or not itself. So yeah, it's Dasein's sense of its own potential of being other than it is, or even of just not being at all, what Heidegger calls our being towards death. It's this which portrays the fact that there is a greater reservoir of being beyond what is present to us, and which is able to say no and refuse our desire to go on living, refuse our values and pretensions. So by coming to understand that its authentic being is more than its presence at hand when it shows concern for possibilities for itself, to be other than it is, Dasein is able to make this transcendental distinction, or what Heidegger calls the ontological difference between being as such and being such as it is present at hand. Now, on first impressions, Heidegger's critique of presence by way of Dasein's being towards death might sound like an improvement on Kant and Husserl's transcendental idealisms. As far as Land is concerned, however, Heidegger is still too egocentric, to the extent that he only actually ever talks of being in terms of the human being. Even when Heidegger speaks of our being towards death, it is always a death that is a phenomenal correlate to that which lives, to the living. This is, Heidegger himself says this quite clearly. He says, death does indeed reveal itself as a loss, but a loss such as is experienced by those who remain. In suffering this loss, however, we have no way of access to the loss of being as such which the dying man suffers. So being towards death is actually not something that happens, that strikes and annihilates us from without. It's merely a phenomenon that Dasein thinks. And given that Land sees the fundamental nature of dogmatic metaphysics as an inability to think death, as we'll see in more detail, an inability to think death except from the point of view of the living, Heidegger remains, for Land, caught in a metaphysical thinking which can only think death phenomenologically rather than, factually or biologically. So this is from, Land already had this critique in his 87 dissertation, PhD dissertation, where he says, metaphysics is unable to follow such a thought because it interprets dying as a process undergone by a subject who dies. It fails to pursue the erosion of the subject, even when the question of the subject is displaced by that of the Dasein. Okay. Now that's a pretty kind of brief and schematic outline of a certain phenomenological tradition that Land is going to try and demolish. So what I want to do now is sort of narrow in on a specific, more detailed case study of how this plays out. So in Land's 1990 essay, Narcissism and Dispersion, in Heidegger's 1952 Trakl interpretation, Land focuses on Heidegger's reading, or misreading, of Trakl's poetry as a way to sort of demonstrate what is exemplary about Heidegger's and phenomenology's anthropocentrism. Now, as other commentators have noted, other Traklian scholars, Land accuses Heidegger of very selectively choosing, distorting, and reshaping the poems that he analyses to impose his own philosophy through Trakl as a kind of porte-parole. And as Heidegger himself contends, Trakl's poetry is allegedly so systematic that Heidegger only needs to synthesize it into what he calls a single unspoken poem to capture the whole of Trakl's thought. Heidegger says, "The fact that every one of Trakl's poems points with equal steadiness, though not uniformly, to the statements of one side, is evidence of the unique harmony of all of his poems in the single key of his statement." For Land, however, Heidegger's unspoken poem simply just reduces Trakl's extremely dispersive and varied thought to one instance among many others. Heidegger's attempt to systemize Trakl already betrays Trakl, the poet's eclecticism, insofar as Trakl's art, his poetry, is, like his life, profoundly unsystematic. Far from living a kind of orderly, conventional, routine life, Trakl was unemployed, an alcoholic, a drug addict, died of a cocaine overdose, was probably in an incestuous relationship with his sister, and most definitely obsessed with death. So just as Trakl's life was anything but conventional, so does his poetry express a drive towards dispersion and dissolution that undermines any attempt to master, unify, and systematize his words. So Land says, "The evolution of Trakl's style, if it is still possible to write coherently of such a thing, is a drive towards the dissolution of every criterion of evaluation. The last thing we would want is for Heidegger to master these traumatized signs. To learn from Trakl is to write in ashes." Okay, so as we're going to see, Heidegger's reading of Trakl essentially betrays a profound narcissism which violently imposes his thought onto Trakl's poetry in much the same way as we saw last week, the Kantian imagination violently imposed itself on animal sensibility. Okay, now Land proceeds to argue in the essay that if we focus on Trakl's poem Spiritual Twilight, the one poem that Heidegger strategically chooses to analyse in any detail, we can see that Heidegger completely misreads its natural images of dispersion and dissolution for anthropic images of spiritual harmony and rational order. So since we're going to be looking at this poem in detail, I'll just read it out in full. This is the full poem. So this is Spiritual Twilight. "Silent by the forest's edge, dark game is encountered. By the hill the benign breeze gentle dies. The blackbirds lament for silent, and the soft flutes of autumn are at peace in the reeds. Upon a black cloud you travel drunk with poppy seed. The night dark pond, the starry heavens, sister's moon-like voice ever sounds through the sacred night." Okay. Now, on Heidegger's reading, in the first line, this dark game or beast, the German Wild could be translated as either, this dark beast is one and the same with the blue beast that Trakl mentions elsewhere in many of his other poems. The colour blue in Trakl is typically linked to spirit or reason. So, as Trakl simply puts it at one point in a different poem, a blue moment is nothing but soul. Okay, now if the dark beast is one and the same with the blue beast, as Heidegger contends, the beast in question is none other than the human animal, the rational animal. Heidegger says, "The blue game is an animal whose animality presumably does not consist in its animal nature, but in that thoughtfully recalling look for which the poet caused. This animal, the thinking animal, animal rational, is man." So, Land uses Heidegger's conflation of Trakl's dark and blue beasts in the first line as just an initial example of the way that Heidegger is going to misrecognize animal savagery for human rationality consistently in a way which subsumes the feral alterity of nature into our mirror reflection. And we can already see, I think, from the citation to Heidegger that he envisions the essential nature of the blue human beast as the ability to reflexively take itself as an object of its own thought, to have rational self-consciousness. So since Heidegger interprets the dark beast as the rational animal, he also reads the night dark pond in the poem as symbolizing humanity's rational essence, insofar as looking into a pool of water returns our reflection. Heidegger says, "The waters, which are sometimes black and sometimes blue, show to man his countenance, his countering glance." So again, here as with the dark beast, Land argues that Heidegger transposes a natural image in Trakl's poem into an instrument for reason's self-reflection. And in fact, Heidegger's reading of the dark night pond here is even more megalomaniacal than his reading of the dark beast, insofar as it superimposes the image of humans alone over the entire starry heavens that are reflected in the dark night pond in the next line. The dark night pond, the starry heavens, right? So this is what Land means when he says, Heidegger first turns to the pool itself, beside which humanity lies, lost in narcissistic reverie. Here humanity gazes upon itself. So for Land, what he calls Heidegger's post-Kantian thinking of nature only in terms of our own possible objects of experience betrays a still too metaphysical or what Heidegger called onto-theological commitment at the core of Heidegger's reading of Trakl, which would reduce being to what is present at hand to us. So Land says, these concerns are bound up with Heidegger's pursuit of that reflection which yields an image of human transcendence, and therefore marks a firmly established separation of Dasein from the psychology of animals. This pursuit is perhaps the aspect of Heidegger's work which is closest to the concerns of the onto-theological tradition, the point where his thinking is most human or too human. So the idea is that far from disclosing being as that which withdraws from all presence, Heidegger reduces a kind of animal alterity and even the entire cosmos, the starry heavens, to tools of the subject's narcissistic gaze. So what Heidegger's, I think what we could call delusions of grandeur, overlook is that Trakl's pond does not return our own familiar reflection in the obscurity of the twilight night, but rather precisely a dark night void, the dark night pond. There's no suggestion that there's a reflection there. And that is the real meaning of the title of the poem, Spiritual Twilight, right? As twilight falls, night falls, the pond is darkened and our own reflection obscured. So what the dark night pond at night returns is nothing but nothingness itself, a dark and fluid abyss. The reflection in the pond, or lack thereof, is actually closer to the dark skies at night than it is to any image of Homo sapien. So consequently, Trakl's compound image of the dark night pond, followed by the starry heavens, does not attest to the primacy of reasons, as it does to actually reason's finitude before nature, which kind of indifferently nullifies our pretensions to exhaust it. Land says, in the darkened pool, the gaze does not return in a familiar form. It reveals instead an abyssal twilight blue, which colours both the dawn and dusk of the spiriting night. The image of no thing returns. Reflection is shattered against the impersonal, against the impassive shade of a pure opening or cleft in beings. So what Heidegger's interpretation of the dark night pond and the dark beast as the blue spirit, rational animal, overlooks for Land is that the nightfall that Trakl is tracing in Spiritual Twilight is precisely the nightfall or the twilight of spirit itself. Sorry. Okay, now Trakl follows up the image of the starry heavens with that of the moon, or more precisely, the sister's moon-like voice, with this sister figure recurring throughout Trakl's poetry, quite frequently. Now here as before, Heidegger interprets the sister's lunar voice as a symbol of the illumination of reason that Trakl's poem supposedly traces. So Heidegger says, The lunar coolness of the ghostly night's holy blue rings and shines through all such gazing and saying. Its language becomes a saying after. It becomes poetry. As with the dark beast in the Dark Night Pond, Heidegger is again anthropomorphizing the sister's lunar core as the voice of reason rather than as the moon itself, the call of the night itself. Whereas the sister's lunar voice on Heidegger's reading marks the becoming of spirit's self-reflection, Land argues that this ignores the fact that Trakl often uses lunar images as precisely symbols of lunacy, madness, disease, and sickness. Land says, the Traklian night is, as we have seen, the time of derangement, consonant perhaps with the mania that stems, like moon and mind, from the Indo-European road. It's no accident that the moon in Trakl's poems is often accompanied by dark beasts, which do not denote rational animals, but rather wolves, or even more precisely, subhuman werewolves, humans becoming wolves. Land says, the moon is also the companion of lunatics and werewolves, figures with whom the reader of Trakl is certainly familiar. So where Heidegger reads the sister's lunar voice as a call of spirit to commune with itself, Land instead conjoins the sister's lunar voice to spirit's exact opposite. It's spirit's becoming animal, which is to say base, wild, deranged, perhaps even, as we'll see, murderous. Now, Land finds further textual support for his reading of Trakl as a poet of spirit's twilight dispersion in the final lines of another poem titled Dream and Derangement. So in this poem, another figure travelling at nightfall comes upon his father's house, only to find it abandoned, a broken mirror inside, and his sister tempting him further into the mad siblinghood of what Trakl calls an accursed race of dark beasts. So just to quote the key passage from the poem, Trakl writes, at evening he came upon the wasteland, escort to a dead man into the dark house of his father. A purple cloud wreathed his brow, that he fell upon his own blood and image in silence, a moon-like countenance. It only sank into a void, when in a broken mirror there appeared a dying youth, his sister, night swallowed up the accursed race. On Land's reading of this poem, the broken mirror, like the Dark Night Pond in the other poem, refers to the way that the traveller does not return home to find his father's house in the state it had been in when he left. On the contrary, the traveller now finds a place that he does not recognise and where he cannot even recognise his own countenance. And nor does the mirror return his own image. It instead returns the image of a stranger, something familiar that has become strange, namely his dying sister. So Land writes, it is the night pool with its subtly differentiated luminosities, a series of intensities which defy resolution within any dialectic of presence and absence, that flood into the mirror with the sister, shattering every power of representation. Without any familiar coordinates to find his way through the twilit house, the traveller at the end of the poem is once more swallowed up by the sister's core to tread ever deeper into the night and join her accursed race. Now, here's elsewhere, the incestuous figure of the sister marks the transgression of the patriarchal law, insofar she guides the traveller away from his father's house, which in any case the deceased patriarch has abandoned. So this Land's reading of the sister figure in Trakl, it might sound familiar because I think it's very similar to the way he analyses the kind of lesbian warrior women that we looked at last week, right? So for example, Land says, she no longer obeys the law of the boundary by mediating the family with itself, sublimating its narcissism. Instead, she breaches the family by opening it onto an alterity which has not been appropriated in advance to any deep structure or encompassing system. So in both Dream and Derangement and in Spiritual Twilight, what Land is trying to show is that Trakl is doing the exact opposite that Heidegger imagines, right? Not reinforcing reason's narcissism, but animalizing, shattering, cursing, and deranging it. Now, at this point in the essay, Land digresses to analyse a passage from Hegel's Philosophy of Nature. Okay, so back to Hegel for a bit. Now, there's already an obvious affinity, I think, between Hegel and Heidegger here, to the extent that Heidegger reads natural objects in Trakl's poetry as the means of spirit's return to itself And that's in much the same way that Hegel sees the object as the subject's way of relating to itself in order to become self-conscious, by paradoxically negating itself as an object of its own thought. But what Land is particularly interested in here is Hegel's argument in the philosophy of nature that cosmology and astronomy should focus on the orderly and well-choreographed arrangement of the planets and how they move around the sun, rather than focusing on the disordered and poorly arranged stars, which Hegel compares to a rash, the German Ausschlag, or an insect, a dark beast. So this is from, I think this is the passage Land is talking about. Hegel says, this eruption of light, Lichtausschlag, is as little worthy of wonderment as an eruption, Ausschlag, on the skin or a swarm of flies. The multitude of stars in immeasurable space means nothing to reason. This is externality, the void, the negative infinitude to which reason knows itself to be superior. So reason is apparently superior to the cosmos in Hegel. Okay, so according to Land, what draws Hegel's ire here is the way that the stars are randomly dispersed in such a way as to possess seemingly, obviously they do, but seemingly no rational principles for their constellations. And it's in this sense that they resemble an outbreak of disease which accurses the orderly sky's smooth functioning. Land says, what offends Hegel about the stars is the irrational facticity of their distribution, a scattering which obeys no discernible law. He expresses his disdain for its distribution and his anxiety before it in a word that is also both a powerful description and an acknowledgement, Ausschlag, which can mean swing or deflection, but in this context means outbreak in the sense of a rash. So in other words, what Hegel fears here is an outbreak of the irrational which would infect spirit and sap its strength to subsume and synthesize nature into the means for its own becoming. Okay, now if Land digresses to address Hegel's comparison of dispersed stars to a disease, it's because Trakl uses the same word, Ausschlag, to refer to both the affliction of lepers and also the flight of animals, particularly birds and ravens as they disperse. There is nonetheless a really crucial difference in Hegel and Trakl's understanding of this term Ausschlag, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing awfully, but in any case. Whereas Hegel sees disease as a kind of defect or privation of absolute spirit, Trakl envisions disease as reason's subversion by nature's greater animal sensibility. In Land's terms, it is no longer even that sentience is infected by irrationality. It is rather that sentience has dissolved into the very movement of infection, becoming a virulent element of contagious matter. For Trakl, the irrational is not simply the negation of spirit without any reality of its own. It's rather nature's positive plenitude which spirit cannot fully comprehend. Given then that Ausschlag captures the essence of nature for Trakl, Land suggests that it is highly problematic for Heidegger to never mention leprosy in his discussion of Trakl. Although Land notes that Heidegger does have a space specifically allocated to disease in his reading, Land concludes that this supplement to Trakl's text is disappointingly regressive on the issue. And this is because Heidegger reads Trakl's concept of madness as a very limited and controlled madness, a gentle madness that amounts to thinking differently from others, and particularly thinking differently from the dogmatic metaphysicians of the past, while still subsuming all things under the concept of Geist, of spirit. So this is how Heidegger characterizes madness in Trakl. He says, madness here does not mean a mind filled with senseless delusions. The madman's mind senses in fact as no one else does. His madness may be called gentle, for his mind pursues a greater stillness. Okay, in the same vein, Heidegger does not read Trakl's frequent images of the dead as denoting real death, but instead he reads death in Trakl as ghostly, and hence as death's exact living and spiritual opposite, right? So here are some examples. Heidegger says, ghostly means by what is by way of the spirit, stems from it and follows its nature. The dead one lives in his grace. He lives in his chamber so quietly and lost in thought. So in the final analysis of Heidegger's essay, he reads the Traklian Stranger's Night Journey in Spiritual Twilight as if it meant ascending from the wild and the animal to self-reflection and ultimately what Heidegger calls the holy blue of absolute spirit. So Heidegger says, the language that his poetry speaks stems from this transition. Its path leads from the downfall of all that decays over to the descent into the twilight blue of the holy. And Heidegger goes on, how shallow is our thinking if we regard the singer of the Occidental song as the poet of decay. His poetry sings of the destiny which casts mankind in its still withheld nature, that is to say, saves mankind. It's ultimately Heidegger's misrecognition of Traklian images here of leprosy, dispersion, and even death as merely way stations on the way to absolute spirit's self-revelation. It's this which, for Land, most clearly betrays Heidegger's kind of cryptic commitment to the metaphysics of presence. On the contrary, for Land's Trakl, it's precisely such moments of disease and dissolution that regionalise reason when confronted with nature's greater cosmic abyss of irrationality, animality, matter, and non-sentience. If we read his poems in this way, Trakl's focus on the stars' dispersions over the orderly arrangement of the planets effectuates a kind of reassessment of the classical metaphysical hierarchy, namely, what's going on here is that instead of cohering all of nature as so many inferior instances of reason, of absolute spirit, of the divine, Trakl conceives of reason as the inferior instance of nature's true ineffable chaos. So Land writes, the stars are traces of a primordial strewing, an explosive dispersion, which in its formlessness defies mathematization or the reduction to order. It is the shockwave of this metaphoric which sweeps through Trakl's specifications of the song, and it is perhaps for this reason that Trakl writes of ruination in this context. So instead of following Trakl to the end and doing away with metaphysics, once and for all, Heidegger does approach this dispersion of presence, of metaphysics, only to sort of recoil from its complete decimation at the last minute. And Land is clearly seeing this as a similar thing to what Kant does with his conception of the noumena as a limit concept as well, right? That we looked at last week. Namely, much as Kant did when he critiqued metaphysics, only to restore its fundamental, metaphysical claims through practical reason and faith, so is Heidegger merely providing what Land calls a gentle critique of metaphysics, as he limits nature's, contagion, which Heidegger himself initially let loose, at the point where Heidegger realizes that this contagion can only lead to reason's complete and utter decimation. So this is Land at the end of the essay. He writes, Heidegger is engaged in what we could legitimately describe as a gentle critique of the history of metaphysics, a grotesque recapitulation of Kant's compromise with ontotheological tradition. It is according to this deeply rooted logic of purification and transcendence, the most insidious trope of a decomposing theology, that the eruption of ecstatic difference refuses the name Aussatz, and Heidegger, exhausted and uncomfortably feverish, lays down his copy of Trakl's poems and closes his eyes. So contrary to Heidegger's reading, Land is adamant that the poetic voice which summons Trakl is none other than death, the twilight of spirit and the surpassing of the metaphysics of presence once and for all. Okay. All right, I'll begin the second part because it's a bit longer and then we can take a little break. Okay. Now, at the end of his Narcissism and Dispersion essay, Land suggests that Derrida's deconstructive approach is subject to the same critique he is making of Heidegger's gentle compromise with ontotheology. And Land particularly expands upon this claim, only briefly mentioned in Narcissism and Dispersion. Land expands upon it in both The Thirst for Annihilation and also his 1993 essay, Spirit and Teeth. So just to give a bit of background here, in Of Grammatology, published in 1967, among other works, Derrida argues, much like Heidegger, that the history of philosophy has too often amounted to a metaphysics of presence, from the Greek philosophy of the logos and the medieval Christian concept of a rather anthropomorphic God, to the contemporary phenomenological concepts of the subject. Now, Derrida names metaphysics of presence, or what Derrida also calls logocentrism. This kind of thinking which privileges a particular being, usually one directly accessible to us, as the fundamental being of all things as such, of all reality. Now, Derrida's issue with logocentrism is that it denigrates everything that differs from an allegedly absolute presence. It denigrates everything else as a secondary, inferior copy without any reality of its own apart from that which it copies and imitates whilst simultaneously corrupting. And Derrida's most famous example of logocentrism is the way in which Ferdinand Saussure, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Jean-Jacques Rousseau and other figures all tend to reify speaking, as a natural, direct and spontaneous expression of the speaking subject's thoughts, the logos. So what particularly draws Derrida's eye here is how it's such an understanding of speech, which confers presence to speech, delegitimates writing as natural speech's inferior, calculated, artificial, and secondary translation. Yeah. So in order to deconstruct this particular logocentric metaphysics of presence, Derrida focuses on how Saussure's structural linguistics imminently betrays the fact that not only writing, but also speech and all forms of discourse are founded upon a primal difference which is actually constitutive of presence, rather than the inverse. Even as Saussure himself does claim at times that at least phonetic signs gravitate around a fixed kind of external reference, a kind of presence, Derrida notes that Saussure elsewhere acknowledges that written signifiers arbitrarily refer to other signifiers or words to denote meaning, right? So we could think of it, if you need to look up the meaning of a word, you look it up in the dictionary and other words are used to define that word, right? So all Derrida really has to do here to abolish presence is to generalize all words or signifiers, be they spoken or written, as only presenting any meaning by referring to and differing from the traces of other words and signifiers. And further, Derrida continues that these other words, these other signifiers used to define the initial word, are not themselves some kind of primal referent or presence, but those words must also refer and differ from other words in order to garner meaning, right? So if you look up you need to look up one word in the dictionary, you look up that word, it refers and differs from other words to define itself, but then if you look up those words also use other words to define themselves and so on. There's no way out of this, right? As Derrida famously puts it, there is no outside text. That is, there's no ultimate point of reference outside this differential play of one signifier's difference from another. So yeah, what Derrida shows is that every signifier is always already corrupted by this kind of differential signifying movement, what Derrida calls at various times archie-writing, or difference spelt with an A, so difference. Now, while acknowledging in his dissertation that Derrida's critique of Heidegger generally moves in the right direction, Land goes on to argue that Derrida nonetheless makes a similar mistake of failing to affirm difference all the way, insofar as Derrida comes to see difference as actually presupposing its opposite of presence. So in the same breath that Derrida's deconstruction seems to undermine the metaphysics of presence, Derrida does qualify that he's not seeking to valorize the differed and neglected term in any kind of dualism. Because for Derrida, doing so would just merely recapitulate the metaphysics of presence's privileging of a single signifier over all the others, even if it is the opposite term to the term reified in traditional metaphysics. In reality, for Derrida, even the opposite term is itself constituted by still other terms, and so on ad infinitum. So when we look at it in this way, there's no outside of presence any more than there is an outside of difference. Derrida says, this is the third point, there is no transgression if one understands by this the pure and simple installation in a beyond of metaphysics. Even the concept of excess or transgression will become suspect. Yeah, so the idea is that we can never really affirm or approach a difference beyond or presence, Rather, every deconstruction of presence is itself appropriated by a new regime of presence. This is, again, the first quote to Derrida. He says, "Difference does not resist appropriation. It does not impose on it an exterior limit. It began by undermining alienation, and it finishes by letting reappropriation undermine, until death. Difference produces that which it prohibits, renders possible even what it renders impossible." On Land's reading then, deconstruction certainly displaces phenomena reified as presence by demonstrating how they presuppose an absent term. But rather than pursue difference to the end in a way which would obliterate all presence altogether, Derrida shows how even the absent term presupposes a form of presence. So far from displacing all presence by showing how absence is implied and foundational, Derrida displaces absence by showing that presence can be equally presupposed. So difference for Derrida is never the absolute negation of presence, it's just merely a temporary suspension. And if this is problematic for Land, it's because he sees deconstruction as actually delaying rather than affirming the negation of presence through a constant undecidability, that's Derrida's word, an undecidability that sees every negation of presence as recuperable by the very presence it undermines. So again, by displacing presence without going all the way to its utter annihilation, Derrida maintains a kind of dualism between presence and absence, narcissism and dispersion, hope and disappointment, being and non-being, life and death. So in the last quote there, Land says, "It is precisely because Derrida will refuse to underwrite such a discrimination that he turns instead to a reinscription of continuities that are able to encompass and partially assimilate the ruptural aspect of his own work, reassigned to a structurally necessary inadequacy in the prosecution of deconstruction." Seen in this way, Derrida's deconstruction still expresses a typically kind of Heideggerian desire for an uncontaminated presence as it deconstructs every presence only to assimilate that rupture back into presence. Again, I realise I've said presence a lot here and it's a very abstract term, so I'm going to give a concrete example now. So, in Land's view, the clearest example of Derrida's gentle compromise with presence is the way that he refuses to fully identify as an atheist. And this is because Derrida sees atheism as presupposing the very religiosity that atheism seeks to oppose, in as much as atheism has to differ from religion in order to affirm itself, right? So, for example, in a short essay of Derrida's called Circumfessions, written, I think, quite notably in response to the death of his mother, Derrida goes so far as to say that even as he, quote, rightly passes for an atheist, his deconstructive approach addresses itself as a prayer to God. Derrida says, I am addressing myself here to God, the only one I take as a witness. I pray as I have never stopped doing all my life, and I pray to him. When asked at a conference why Derrida cannot simply say that he is an atheist, in a straightforward sense, Derrida says that he must maintain this kind of infinite series of qualifications and concessions. He says, I would answer these questions with an endless number of protocols, and that's what my life is made of. Sounds fun. So for Derrida, to say that God does not exist immediately presupposes God does exist, at least in a practical sense, since every refutation is dependent and grounded upon that which it refutes. Derrida says again, if I say God doesn't exist, I would immediately say the opposite. God exists even if, and especially if he doesn't exist. Because how powerful this non-existence should be to produce such extraordinary phenomena in what is called man. So it's because Derrida continually displaces the death of God that many theologians, have been able to actually align deconstruction with at least radical theology's own ceaseless displacements of a pure divine presence into the mysterious beyond. So there are many theologians, particularly negative theologians, who are highly influenced by Derrida's deconstruction. John D. Caputo being probably the most notable. But so this is the kind of priestly collaborationism that Land is taking issue with here. So Land says, even if Derrida were subject to an anti-theistic inclination, he could only be driven by his philosophy to search for that which institutes the difference between the presence and absence of God, something like Schelling's absolute or Heidegger's being, a search which is scarcely distinguishable from Mauve's long familiar two radical theologians. So again, just to sort of link it back to last week, Land's idea is that much as Kant saved theology by attacking its metaphysical basis only to re-establish it on practical transcendental grounds, so does Derrida undermine the metaphysics of presence only to end up resuscitating it on deconstructive grounds. Land says, the strategy adopted in both cases is essentially Kantian. If there is something you want to protect, attack it with measured vigour yourself, thus investing it with replenished force and preempting its annihilation. Deconstruction is like capital, managed and reluctant change. Yeah, this is the ontological logic that Land is getting at when he says that deconstruction cannot ever really negate presence, since it sees every negation, again, as presupposing the very presence it supposedly obviates. So I just have that painting there because I think the prodigal son is basically that's a nice kind of parable of deconstruction, really. Now, so instead of repudiating difference in favour of a restored presence, what we're going to look at after the break is that Land wants to argue that we need to cultivate further this kind of logic of the traits of difference, keep cultivating it until we reach a kind of absolute primordial difference from whence we could critique not only metaphysics, but also Heidegger's ontology and Derrida's deconstruction as merely Kantian sidesteps on the way to the inhuman outside, right? Okay, so, yeah, although Land's 1993 essay, Spirit and Teeth, also seeks to kind of wage a virulent critique of Derrida's deconstruction, and particularly Derrida's reading of Heidegger's reading of Trakl, it's also, I think, the earliest essay where one of the earliest essays where Land develops a clearly more kind of, constructive or positive philosophy of his own by drawing upon certain conceptual resources that he finds in Trakl. In the rest of this lecture, I want to show how Land draws upon kind of images of death, wolves, and rats, specifically, in Trakl's poetry, in order to develop something that I'm calling here a threefold hermeneutic of reading with Fangs. A reading which essentially critiques a discourse by confronting it with the brute fact of its mortal and irrational ground, at ever more kind of obliterating scales of intensity. I think there's kind of... I'm going to go through all of these in detail as we work through the essay, but just to kind of give an outline to start with. There's three aspects to this reading with Fangs. So the first approach, I think, models reading on an autopsy by critiquing a philosopher's failure to recognise their own finitude. The second approach then infects the philosopher's text with what I'm calling a lycanthropy that undermines the text's rationality by showing how it actually presupposes a repressed animality. And a final technique, modelled on rodentology, the study of rats, reassesses a philosopher's kind of hierarchization of irrationality, animality, and matter as kind of inferior instances of reason. It reassesses these three moments as actually ever more intensive encounters with a primordial inhuman reality. So Land doesn't actually use these three terms, but there's a kind of Nietzsche says of Schopenhauer that Schopenhauer is the great simplifier of Kant. And so just what I'm trying to do here is some kind of more kind of rigorization or simplification of what I think the kind of methodology that Land is using to critique Derrida and Heidegger and so on. Okay, so the title of the essay's introductory section, A Preliminary Postmortem, I think immediately indicates the way that Land proposes to model his reading of philosophers on an autopsy. So Land begins the essay by lamenting the way that Hegel and his disciples, as we have seen, have turned spirit, reason, and the concept into the cosmic principle of all things which they oppose to animality, irrationality, and brute matter. In the words of the essay's title, it's a matter of reifying spirit to the denigration of teeth and the bite marks that teeth can inflict. In what is, I think, quite interestingly, Land's first use of cybernetics and artificial intelligence to critique metaphysics, Land notes that modern science, and particularly AI research, specifically research into how we can create life and consciousness, All of this has exposed the way that spirit is reducible to physical processes of I guess, informational processing. So Land says, spirit has been inflated by Hegel into the cosmic medium of transaction before finally succumbing to an irreparable marginalization by the scientific advances of experimental and behavioral psychology, neurology, neuroanatomy, cognitive science, cybernetics, and artificial intelligence. So, despite the kind of falling of spirit into rebuke due to the modern sciences, if Land still finds it necessary to lament this kind of Hegelian absolutization of spirit in our own time, or in his time, in the 90s, it's because he sees this kind of Hegelianism as persisting throughout the 20th century, specifically in the guise of, as we've begun to see, phenomenology, and what Land calls phenomenology's, what he calls prolonged refusal of the impersonal. So again, in this essay, Land says, whether High Church Hegel or Low Church Husserl, phenomenology is the definitive ideology of prosperity, systematically employing the interrogative mode in order to distill out everything for which proper subjectivity cannot claim responsibility, and thus entrenching the humanistic dimensions of Western philosophy ever more rigidly. Now, we've begun to see that in Land's own time, he sees Derrida's dominant deconstructive approach as particularly championing Heidegger's endless questioning into the meaning of being beyond presence, not so as to do away with ontotheology and metaphysics, but actually to delay their eventual demise. Far from marking humanity's highest wisdom, then, Land argues that the history of at least Western philosophy, since at least Hegel, has largely been a rather primitive parochialism that projects ourselves onto the cosmos as if the cosmos were forever beholden to what is merely a brief anthropic instance, a caprice of natural selection in the cosmos's greater becoming. So Land says, let us not forget that philosophy is also primate psychology, that our loftiest speculations are merely picking through a minuscule region of the variegated slime encrusting a speck of dust. Now, above all, Land takes issue with how phenomenology is what he calls the mark of a clownish incompetence at death, and this is to the extent that a crucial corollary of phenomenology's reification of spirit is that death, the ultimate exteriority, becomes unthinkable and even impossible. He says, Land says, the entire current gradually implies an attempted proof of the impossibility of death, an ontological conflation of access to reality and ownership, a perpetually reformulated spiritualism. The idea is that, much as primordial kind of myths of anthropomorphic gods were concocted, at least in part, to console early humans when confronted with a chaotic and hostile world, so does even modern, supposedly more scientific philosophy betray the same kind of primitive effort to comfort us by displacing the brute fact of our finitude through so many reifications of spirit, each one seemingly more complex and intricate, but yet also more desperate and naive than the last. Now, Land argues, and this is really a crucial point, if thought cannot grasp reality's kind of radical alterity without reducing it to a thing for us, then perhaps the only way to access the real is at the limit or even death of thought itself. Death, after all, marks precisely the cessation of subjectivity. And so, like Kant's noumena, death is precisely that before which thinking falls silent. It's thus death that marks the ultimate testament to the fact that reality exceeds what we can think of it. As Land puts it, beyond the anthropoid gesticulations of knowing, suspension is not differentiable from death, one's death, as we so ludicrously say, and death does not belong to an order that can be delayed. Given that death marks the brute fact of a reality without us, Land argues that the goal of any philosophy sincerely committed to the love of wisdom, philosophia, ought to also be committed to the love of death, necrophilia, right? And I think therein lies Land's solution to overcoming post-Kantian anthropocentrism, namely, transfigure death into the transcendental condition by which we judge every philosopher's claim to grasp the real as valid only to the extent that they can confess and affirm their own finitude, the limits of their own thinking. I think Land actually best puts this in another 1993 essay we will look at later on, an essay called Making It with Death. And I think this quote is actually maybe the most important line in all of Land in order to understand his entire project from the 80s till today even. So Land says, death is the impersonal subject of critique and not an accursed value in the service of a condemnation. Death is the impersonal subject of critique and not an accursed value in the service of a condemnation. So again, just to put it in terms that I did last week as well, instead of a transcendental idealist critique of thought's attempts to go beyond itself by subsuming its understanding of the absolute under the concepts of reason, Land proposes a transcendental materialist critique of attempts to limit thought to itself by showing how thought presupposes and yet represses the inevitability of its own future extinction in order to constitute the concepts of reason. So seen from this kind of skewed Caligarian sort of angle, Land's interest in Trakl is not so much as a person or even a poet, but as someone who was able to trace and sketch at the margins of our all too human language the morbid intensities of the inhuman outside. Trakl's poetry does not stem from his own thought, but rather from the disruptions of his thought as death infected him, obsessed him, wounded him, and ultimately finished him, all the while also thoroughly delighting him. And this is what Land is getting at, I think, when he says, quote, "It is perhaps more precise to say that Trakl never existed except as a battlefield, a reservoir of disease, the graveyard of a deconsecrated church." What Land, I think, is discovering in Trakl is this critical insight that mortality is not a fact to be bemoaned or repressed. Instead, death is to be championed as an instrument, as the organon for the critique of all anthropocentric philosophies, so as to set the stage for reality's recession from the clutches of our concepts. Okay, and that's exactly why I'm proposing here to characterize Land's reading of philosophy as a kind of methodological autopsy. Now, one possible, definition of an autopsy would be something like: an autopsy is a surgically precise dissection and rigorous examination of a corpse in order to determine the cause and manner of its death, both for educational purposes of understanding, but also juridical purposes of seeking justice in the case of criminal cases into suspected murder cases. So I think we can identify 4 essential elements to the autopsy, right? Its surgical precision, the determination of the cause of death, and the twofold aim of seeking truth and delivering justice. So to model hermeneutics or interpretation on an autopsy would therefore, I think, involve reading the surgical dissection of the corpse as a rigorous philosophical critique of a dying or dead corpus with an eye to identifying the corpus's cause of death, right? And here the corpus's cause of death has 2 significations. One positive, and one kind of negative. So on the one hand, its negative sense signals that the aim of a post-mortem hermeneutic is to critique or precisely kill off the corpus that it's analysing, to precisely cause its death. And on the other hand, its positive sense involves showing how the corpus is constituted as a kind of sublimated response to its true ground of death in order to repress and delay death's traumatic impact. Consequently, the pedagogical function would be to try and garner an understanding of the reality of death by stripping away and subtracting anthropocentric qualities which philosophical corpuses too often project onto death. And finally, the juridical purpose would be to develop a kind of new non-Kantian categorical imperative that no longer submits everything to reason's unconditional law. On the contrary, a post-mortem imperative would stipulate that if reason wishes to maintain its rather dubious pretensions to love wisdom, it will have to unconditionally affirm our own death and by doing so sort of disclose a greater reservoir of non-being beyond life and thought. So according to this post-mortem hermeneutics, it's only in searching for humanity's demise that philosophy can escape from the dominant anthropocentrism, again, by confronting us with a world without us. Okay, now the second section of Spirit and Teeth is entitled Wolves, and it's prefaced with an epigraph from Derrida's book Of Spirit, where he promises to patiently read Heidegger's use of the word spirit in Heidegger's Trakl paper, before eventually moving on to address the question of animality. So this is the Derrida quote. As I continue to study this text elsewhere with a more decent patience, I hope one day to be able, beyond what a conference paper permits me today, to render it justice in also analysing its motions, its mode or its status, its relation to philosophical discourse, to hermeneutics or poetics, but still what it says of Geschlecht, the word Geschlecht, and also of place as of animality. But for the moment, I will follow solely the passage of spirit. Now, here Land argues that Derrida's seemingly humble hermeneutic here actually betrays a profound arrogance, to the extent that such a patient, close reading acts as if Derrida were practically immortal, and therefore had the time to devote an entire book to Heidegger's use of just one word in just one of Heidegger's smaller works. Land says, "These are the words of a man who is confident he will survive for some considerable time. There is no discernible urgency here, far less abruptness, desperation, or any of the raw intensities of haste." And, moreover, given that Derrida prioritizes his reading of spirit before that of animality, Land suggests that the careful, painstaking, deconstructive exegesis is not so much motivated by a love of wisdom, detail, and sophistication, as it is by fear of the real yet crude fact of our morbid animal essence that the very order of analysis is designed to postpone. According to Land, Derrida's deconstruction of Heidegger's Trakl text is particularly egregious because such a kind of patient and performatively idealist hermeneutic is prejudiced from the beginning against the real sense of urgency and impending doom that permeates Trakl's poetry. Land says, "An evasion that is perhaps constitutive of hermeneutical decency is exemplified when, by taking one's time over interpreting Trakl's poetry, one avoids succumbing to the pestilence it communicates." So on the contrary, Land's own reading of Trakl's poetry focuses on precisely the recurring and frequent images of animals that Derrida ignores, and particularly animals like rats, ravens, and even more particularly wolves, animals which invoke fright or are associated with disease and death. Even more specifically, Land focuses on Trakl's recurring descriptions of people who are transformed into wolves, or what Land reads as werewolves. Here, Land's not only referring to Trakl's explicit references to wolfmen, dark beasts, but to the way that Trakl's poetry in general amounts to, what I'm calling a becoming werewolf, right? Far more deranged than Deleuze's becoming animal. So like his life, Trakl's poetry was feverish, jarring, indecent, brutish, and short, a true Hobbesian kind of jungle, right? Whether it's from his early drug addiction and his regular brothel visits until his cocaine overdose when he was only 27. Trakl is also a member of the 27 Club. But he's often repressed from membership. So it's in this sense that Land characterizes Trakl's art as a becoming werewolf. Land says, "Trakl's writings are lycanthropic vectors of impatient, of twitch disease, because they are the virulent relics of an indecent precipitation, an abortion, a meteorite impact. Trakl took very little time over anything." So given that Derrida's gentle reading of Heidegger's Trakl essay omits any mention of this lycanthropic meter and rhyme, Land argues, quite bizarrely, that Derrida is not a werewolf, where werewolf denotes precisely Trakl's becoming animal, feral, deranged, impolite, jagged and crude, at every full moon without indecision or delay, right? Land says, "Werewolves are dissipated within a homolupic spiral that distances them utterly from all concern for decency or justice. Creatures of epidemic rather than hermeneutics, werewolves tend to be crude, but then they don't live as long as deconstructionists. The luxury of delaying the problem of animality is not open to them." Whereas Derrida apologizes for even the slightest textual impoliteness, as what Derrida says, precipitating in an indecent fashion, Trakl's accursed race of wolfmen have no such sense of politeness or restraint or etiquette of manners, right? Now, at one point, Land notes that werewolves become accursed by being bitten by other werewolves, of course. And he makes this, he notes this so as to seg into a brief discussion of the great French poet Arthur Rimbaud. Just as Trakl has bitten land, so was Trakl bitten by Rimbaud's poetry, which profoundly influenced, or more precisely infected, his own work. Land thus briefly digresses to look at Rimbaud's own writing, only to discover that Rimbaud also claims to have been bitten by a werewolf and shape-shifted into a brother of the accursed race. Rimbaud says, "I have always belonged to an inferior race. My race never rose up except to pillage, like wolves tearing at the animal they have not killed." For Rimbaud, as for Land and Trakl then, the true goal of poetry is to mutilate the soul and derange the senses by sort of abandoning it in the wilderness, far from civilization, where it can only become feral and deranged and accursed. And this is probably, Rimbaud sort of famously explains this, how the soul must be made monstrous, as he puts it, in what is probably his most famous quotation. He says, "The poet makes himself a seer by a long, gigantic and rational derangement of all the senses. All forms of love, suffering and madness. He searches himself. He exhausts all poisons in himself and keeps only their quintessence. Unspeakable torture where he needs all his faith, every superhuman strength, where he becomes among all men the great patient, the great criminal, the one accursed, and the supreme scholar, because he reaches the unknown." Like Land, then, Rimbaud not only envisions the love of wisdom as a becoming werewolf, but as inextricably tied to a perverse infatuation with sickness, decay, and death. Okay, although Land notes other avenues in both Trakl's poetry and in other poets' works, such as that of Rimbaud, he ultimately focuses on In the East, a poem that Trakl wrote in response to hearing about an attack on a city during the First World War. Just to point out, just as a side note, this is The Company of Wolves, based on Angela Carter's book, is easily the best depiction of cinematic depiction of becoming werewolf. It has the best, as you can see, the best transformation from the human into the werewolf in all of painting, all of cinema. So I highly suggest checking that out. Anyway, that's just a little digression from the film critic here. But okay, let's turn back to In the East. And it's the last stanza that's most important for us here. So I'll just read it out. So Trakl says, "Thorny wilderness girds the city, the moon hounds frightened women, from bleeding steps wild wolves burst through the gate." Now, according to Land, the city here symbolizes the civilization, order and reason that is constantly menaced and girded by the thorny wilderness outside its walls. If the moon can also be said to hound frightened women, it is because the moon again symbolizes the ferocious lunacy of the outside, of nature, which is also then embodied by the wild wolves that burst through the city gates. Land says, "An indeterminate multiplicity of wolves effect a rupture in the boundary of the city, transmitting its positive exteriority into its kernel. Blood, the moon, and women are coagulated by an intensive menstrual seism which shatters the proper difference between life and death." Given that the wolf attack here is precipitated by the hound of the moon, Land imagines these wolves to be actually the city dwellers themselves becoming werewolf, as the wilderness creeps up over the city limits. So the war, of which this poem is about, is actually a civil war within one and the same body politic, torn inside out. Here, the werewolf is the antithetical image to the city because it subverts everything that holds civilization together. As Nietzsche's genealogy of morals showed, unlike humans, animals cannot submit time to the order of making promises and hence succumb to the morality of keeping one's intentions for fear of punishment. So the time of the werewolf is not a logical, rational time of anterior causes and after effects. It's a time of chaos, surprise, brutish insensitivity, and a certain physical jaggedness. Land says, "Such is Trakl's accursed race as well as Rimbaud's, communicating its dirty blood in wilderness spaces of barbarian inarticulacy. Incapable of making promises, even to themselves, they are excluded from every possibility of salvation." On Land's reading of In the East here, What Trakl is doing is waging a war against reason, civilization, and even basic human decency by overrunning the city with the lunacy of the moon that makes werewolves out of us all. Irrational, indecent, uncivilized, inhuman, to put it bluntly, yet in this case, or too fittingly. Okay, now, in his critique of Derrida's failure to take into account Trakl's sort of feral metre and jagged rhyme, Land develops the second aspect of his hermeneutic that I'm terming here lycanthropy, or becoming werewolf. So lycanthropy is an extremely rare psychiatric syndrome whereby the affected patient or person believes that they are able to shapeshift into animal and other non-human forms. So lycanthropy is named precisely after the figure of the werewolf, also known as the lycanthrope. In particularly severe cases, the patient can lose all sense of reason and even the ability to articulate normal speech as they resort to primitive growls and howling. The syndrome can also affect the patient's motor sensory skills as they revert to crawling on all fours like a quadruped. And in some cases, lycanthropes can become aggressive towards humans, even turning on their once familiar family and friends. So if Land's reading of Derrida and other philosophers can be seen as a kind of methodological lycanthropy, it's because he precisely critiques the pretensions to rationality and moral decency by sort of illuminating them under the full moon, where their kind of repressed irrational animality can be seen in full light. So Land's lycanthropic readings amount to the transcendental critique of philosophy for anthropomorphizing the cosmos out of a fear of being unable to tame its base, its true material base of irrationality and animality, tame it in accordance with the concepts of reason. So whenever Land shows how Derrida, amongst other philosophers, displaces animality in favour of patiently and politely studying spirit, he's biting into the deconstructed discourse with materialist fangs in order to infect it with a sense of its truly barbaric ground, which the displacement of animality and the protracted discussion of spirit is designed to domesticate and tame. Okay, in the essay's final part called Rats, Land draws upon the figure of the rat in Trakl's poem of the same name, a poem that Land again rebukes Heidegger for never mentioning, and Land's interested in this poem on rats in order to develop this third and final aspect of his reading with Fangs, the rodentology. Just as a side note again, so the image from Pixar's Ratatouille, it's not actually meant to be a joke, it's meant to be a serious claim that this film has the best, again, lots of superlatives, but the best cinematic depiction of the kind of artistic genius, Trakl as an artistic genius, or what we'll see next week. It has the best depiction of the Kantian concept of creative genius, to the extent that it shows precise. It's literally a film about how a simple dish hand can become the greatest chef in all of Paris by being puppeteered beyond his control by literally a rat, right? So it develops an inhuman conception of creative genius. And in that sense, it's a profoundly morbid and disturbing film. So again, check it out. Okay. All right. Anyway. So Trakl's Rats poem initially depicts an idyllic scene of a white and shining moon and a serene and calming silence before it is quickly perturbed by the sight of rats scuttling out of the sewers. As these rats dart about all over the place, the purity of the white moon assumes a more kind of lupin and eerie glow, as the image of spirit instead becomes that of a ghost. So just to read the poem, this is the full poem. Into the yard the autumn moon shines white. From the roof's edge fantastic shadows fall. In empty windows silence dwells. The rats then quietly steal to the surface, and dart whistling hither and thither, and a horrid vaporous breath wafts after them out of the sewer, through which the ghostly moonlight trembles. Now, in interpreting Trakl's figure of the rat, Land draws on Hans Zinzer's book on rats, lice and history to argue that humans have always hated and hunted rodents as carriers of disease, which reaped widespread death and destruction particularly across Western Christendom. Most notably, rats were central to spreading Europe's three major plague epidemics which fittingly came from the mysterious otherworld of the East, to successively strike at both the Roman Empire, then medieval Christendom, and then modernity itself, each with a greater ferocity than the last, and death toll than the last. So this elucidates why killing rats was viewed very early on as a service to God that protected the sanctity of civilization from the barbarism of a supposedly kind of putrid and deadly Orientalism. At the same time, Land observes that since rats were repressed in Western civilization, they also came to be symbols for repressed desires. This is what Freud captured in the 1909 case of the so-called rat man's compulsive neurotic dreams of an oriental punishment where rats are poured into the anus of the bound victim. And this is to say nothing of Freud's other case of the wolfman. But in any case, sticking to the rat man. Freud's own diagnosis was that the rats in the dream represented the unconscious, a kind of repressed libidinal force that ate away at the rat man's everyday waking life through symptomal bite marks and hisses. So Land says, in the very moment of prowess, the imperial interpretative gesture is taken par derrière, from behind, by an impersonal libidinal force from beyond representational discourse, whether logico-psychiatric or orientalist. Here is with Trakl's wolves. What Land is doing again is seizing upon the rat as another symbol of feral animality that haunts civilization only in portentous traces such as nibbled furniture, scratch marks and squeaks, hisses and fecal droppings. Yeah. Okay, so much as Trakl does not flee but rather feeds the rats in the Twilight Yard in the poem, to trace these symptomal footprints of the outside on the inside, Land models his final hermeneutical technique on the science of rodentology, the study of rats. Here, Land aims to subvert the classical Aristotelian and Christian hierarchy of beings, whereby rational creatures like humans and angels are held to incarnate the divine being, the absolute spirit, to the denigration of animals, non-sapient organisms, and, of course, inert brute matter, as ever lowlier privations of this absolute spirit. So just to use St. Augustine's version, the hierarchy of beings traditionally has 3 levels. So the lowliest appetitive level consists of all things which desire their self-preservation, be they sapient like humans or sentient like plants. Even plants sort of stretch towards the light, right? As if seeking preservation. The second sensitive level refers to all living things, from animals to humans, which have the ability to sense perceive their external environment and examine it, investigate it in such a way as to pursue their needs. And finally, the rational level is exclusively comprised of humans, also actually angels, insofar as we alone have the capacity to rationally think about ourselves. So Augustine says, that by which humans are marked above animals, whatever it is, be it more correctly called mind or spirit or both, if it dominates and commands the rest of what a human consists in, then that human being is completely in order. Note that inert base matter is excluded entirely from Augustine's hierarchy, insofar as he sees it as nothing other than nothingness itself, than just a pure privation of spirit, of being, through when we become ensnared in the temporal world through sin, right? Augustine says, disease is not a substance, but a defect in the fleshy substance, that is, privations of the good which we call health. So it's precisely this kind of ever greater denigration of inert matter, irrationality and animality in favour of spirit and reason that Land's Traklian kind of hermeneutics is designed to counteract. Rather than envision the animal and the irrational as inferior degrees of being's highest instance in the spirit of reason, Land reconceives them as ever more intensive incursions of the true being of non-being, of the irrational and the animal and the sensible. So again, seen from this skewed angle, it's the repressed, the lowly and the base, or what in Trakl's terms, the marsupial and the sewer dwellers. It's these figures which will most intensively instantiate the real. And on the other hand, it's precisely spirits fallacious self-aggrandizing to the exclusion of anything that cannot be synthesized by it. It's this which becomes the privation of nature by submitting nature's greater totality to a single anthropic instance. And Land actually already anticipated this reassessment of the classical hierarchy of beings in the second part of the essay, when he took note of the bleeding steps in Trakl's poem In the East, that the wolves leave behind, with these steps being just one example of the recurring images of steps in Trakl's poetry, steps which always lead to madness and into nature, away from the city. So there's many steps, for example, steps of madness, mossy steps, ruined steps, steps of the wood, lots of steps in Trakl. So according to Land, these steps should be interpreted as ever more intensive excursions into the wilderness beyond, the polis's protective walls. That's the idea. Land says, it is a language of gradation, degree, abstrafum. Heterogeneous strata of intensity which involve irresolvable complexity, diversity, indefinite protectability in both directions, the default of absolute thresholds, and economics of incommensurability, and a compulsively recurrent abortion of the concept. Here, humanity's becoming werewolf should not be seen as a regression to a kind of primitive inferior stage of nature or evolution. It should be seen as rather an even more intensive kind of libidinal charge of impersonal energy before which spirit becomes the true inferior principle of a very partial kind of individuation. As Land stresses, inferiority is not any kind of lack or impoverishment, but a positive libidinal charge potentiating spiritualizations. So turning on its head, the bloody steps as degrees of impersonal intensities emanating from the outside, the city of God, the polis, becomes an extremely partial and secondary sublimation of reality's true lupin becoming when the city fixates the real into discrete orders of stasis, something like that. Discrete orders of stasis which are purported to exhaust all of being. So Land says, the work of the city has never been anything but a mendacious retranscription of the real metamorphoses which re-emerge in lycanthropic becomings. Again, the idea is that far from totalizing the truth of being, ontotheology's notion of spirit, or philosophy in general's notion of spirit, is simply one falsely absolutized, falsely reified intensity of libidinal energy among many other far less inhibited variants. Now, it's in the essay's final section that Land fully articulates this notion of degrees of intensive becomings with reference to Trakl's rats. Here, Land uses the image of a house as a metaphor for the hierarchy of beings, where the room in which the humans live are considered the most important, of course, while the basement is denigrated as a place to store unwanted and forgotten things, and then the pipes and sewer system in between the walls, out of sight, are just forgotten altogether. Although the chamber of pipes, where the rats dwell, notably, is hidden from view, Land notes that they constitute the house's smooth functioning for its human inhabitants. Right? At the same time, it's precisely because they permit us to go about our everyday lives that this kind of realm in between the walls and among the pipes is only ever drawn to our attention when something breaks down. A pipe is clogged or rats nibble away at a wire, turning the lights out. According to Land's inverted hierarchy of degrees of being, just as the house is both constituted and disrupted by this realm of the rodents, right, inside the walls, so too is spirit grounded upon the very animal materiality that it paradoxically represses to affirm itself as, the height, the apotheosis of being. Land says, heaven is not without its rat holes, its sewage system, an entire impersonal architecture characterized by porous heterogeneity. It seems likely that God would insist upon air conditioning and a dumb waiter. Irrespective of his celestial visage, Yahweh still has rat bites on his arse. Disputing Derrida's thesis that it's impossible to ever really hone in on a difference that without re-establishing it as a new regime of presence, Land uses this perverse hierarchy to argue that we can move step by step up, or actually rather down, ever more intense, to locate ever more intensive traces of a primal difference from the irrational in the animal to the inert and ultimately to death itself. So if I propose to characterize Land's tracing of libidinal intensities as a rodentology, it's because he draws on Zinsser's classification of species of rats to articulate this method of cognizing the uncognizable. Land is particularly interested in Zinsser's discussion of the distinction between Rattus rattus, the black rat, or house rat, and Rattus neurovagicus, the grey or brown sewer rat. Although the Black Plague, the great mortality, that spread across Europe and was reaped on the backs of black rats is better known, Zinsser notes at one point that the brown rat's subsequent entry into Europe proved to be far more devastating. Its plague was far worse. Here, Land uses the black and brown rat as an example of two different intensive invasions of the outside. Land is quick to note that these two types of rats should not be seen as two sides of a metaphysical Manichaean dualism. They're rather two relatively distinct gradations of one and the same libidinal energy. After all, the differences between black and brown rats, shades of the same colour spectrum, not polar opposites, black and white, for example. So Land says there are two varieties of rats, but this should not be taken as a gift for our metaphysicians or supposed anti-metaphysicians who are constantly in search of dichotomic conceptual oppositions, a logical differentiation, black and brown, not black and white. Yeah, and by the same token, the attempt to localize different intensities of this feral animality should not be seen as a way of unifying these various intensities into one all-encompassing order. On the contrary, like rats, intensities are swarms. They come in swarms of multiplicity, just as rats scurry in packs, right? And even if we just take a singular rat on its own, that singular rat is still a multiplicity, specifically, to the extent that the rat harbours a swarm of fleas, right? And each flea is in turn a swarm of, viral cells and so on. So it's multiplicities all the way down. Okay, now according to Land, it was Trakl's great merit to have sense that there are different intensities without any one alone capturing the absolute fullness of libidinal energy. This is precisely why Trakl was constantly conjuring up ever new libidinal figures, some of which we've seen, from the sister and the wolfman to rats, ravens and birds, and even Christians and priests, but also Satanists and criminals. Land says, animality is not a state, essence or genus, but a complex space cross-cut by voyages of all kinds. The animality which Trakl finds has its dead ends and stagnant stumps. It has its humanistic and theological becomings, but it also has its channels of open flow, becoming multiple, fluid, unpredictable, becoming an enemy of mankind, lupin and murine becomings of all kinds. So, even the plague doctor assumes a beak, right? The plague doctor itself is also a becoming plague, a becoming animal. So if Land is particularly interested in Trakl's rats above all these other libidinal figures, it's because they best articulate this inverted hierarchy of being by which we're able to sort of localize ever greater intensities of libidinal energy if we follow the bleeding steps descent into decay and dissolution. And we can see, I think, from the last citation's notion of humanistic and theological becomings, that even religion, civilization, and humanity do not comprise a kind of distinct principle or order to the savage outside in what would ultimately amount to establishing the outside in terms of a strict Manichaean dualism. On the contrary, even the metaphysics of presence is one not particularly intensive instance of the wilderness, one which we falsely conflate with all of the wilderness, even as it continues to express itself in many different and contradictory and hostile guises. Therein lies how Land is able to explain why Trakl appears to believe at times that divine redemption is possible, why Trakl becomes a Christian, while still being a virulently nihilistic atheist. Trakl's sort of Christian sense of redemption in some poems does not contradict his other poems that we've looked at, like In the East and Rats, which trace a kind of unilateral, one-way descent into decay and disintegration. For Trakl, as for Land, the Christian can be affirmed so long as one understands that it is one possible and hence contingent sublimation of an inhuman libidinal energy whose other figures equally include Trakl's recurring cast of characters like the criminal, the stranger, the cannibal, the incestuous sister, the leper, the Satanist, the drug addict, and the wolfman. Yeah, so in the second quote, Land says, at times he becomes a Christian among a general confusion of becomings, becoming an animal, becoming a virus, becoming inorganic. Trakl's texts are scrawled over by redemptionist monotheism, just as they are stained by narcotic fluidities, gnawed by rats, cratered by Russian artillery, shard and pitted by astronomical debris. The idea is that when seen from this outside, spirit becomes one contingent materialization of an animal energy that's so voracious that it even cannibalizes itself, right? And to it expresses itself as its exact opposite in the form of the city of God, the polis, order, reason. Okay, so what Land, Spirit and Teeth essay ultimately develops, I think, is not just a specific critique of Derrida's still too phenomenological or too human critique, or philosophy, but also it develops more generally a hermeneutic of reading philosophers by submitting them to this three-fanged assessment. So in the first instance of autopsy, Land's reading calls into question the extent to which a philosopher can recognize their finitude, the finitude of their own thought before the brute fact of their future demise. Through a second interpretative practice of lycanthropy, Land critiques the philosopher's reification of reason for masking the primordial ground of irrational animality and base matter. And finally, Land affects a rodentology that reverses the philosopher's denigration of the irrational, the animal, and the dead as ever greater localizations of an inert yet intensive exteriority to all reason and life. By modelling his Traklian reading of philosophy on an autopsy, lycanthropy, and rodentology, what Land is essentially doing is appropriating the brute fact that every living thing, including even the holy blue spirit, will one day die as the condition for the possibility of critiquing philosophy's self-projections onto the world in a way which reduces all of reality to a mere fragment in what is really nature's awesomely barbarous becoming. Okay, so having critiqued Kant and his phenomenological offspring for masking the brute reality of this death for far too long, and most egregiously in Heidegger's reading of Trakl and Derrida's deconstructive approach, what we're going to see next week is that Land's going to go on to trace an entirely different philosophical tradition with an eye to developing a more constructive philosophy of his own for tasting, encountering, confronting, and being confronted by a base matter's wild and impersonal forces at the sublime edge of our humanity, right? But yeah, we'll leave it there for this week.